Hello, my name is Austin Belzer, and welcome back to the first episode of the Austin B Media podcast in 2025. And in this episode, I'll be sitting down with Clotilde Chinnici. Did I get it right?
It's very close. It's Kim.
Chinnici. Clotilde,
Yes.
Clotilde Chinnici of,
Yes, I was
of
very.
Alliance of Women Film Journalists. Next Best Picture and Loud and Clear Reviews are some of the places you share your work. And we're going to be discussing Wicked today, the film adaptation of the Broadway musical of the same name. You've probably heard it in the last 3 months being talked about everywhere on TikTok and everything like that. Today, we're just going to be going right into it, diving deep into the history with Wicked, Wizard of Oz, discussing story, all that fun stuff that I love to do on this podcast. But but Clotilde, welcome to the podcast. Tell everyone about your work.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Like you said, I do write for a few websites, including the Alliance of Women Film Journalists, which I'm a part of, Next Best Picture, Loud and Clear Reviews. I'll mention a couple more, Movie Marker, and Little White Lies. I'm a freelance journalist. I tend to cover a lot of European festivals or the major European festivals, and specifically the London-based ones because I live in London, although I'm originally from Italy. And I especially like adaptations, love musicals, and I tend to cover European cinema as much as I can.
Yeah, I figured with the posters in the background of Les
It was
Miserables,
good.
we're both theater kids. I guess before we start, is there anything you've watched recently that you'd love to recommend?
I watched The Day of the Jackal and I really
Oh, how's
liked it.
that?
It's really good. I didn't read the book, but I actually have it over there. But it's surprisingly, because my dad has read it and I was talking to him about it, and surprisingly, it's quite different from the source material, but I think it works really well. Eddie Redmayne is just brilliant as always, so it was very fun to see him in a role I had never seen him before. I really enjoyed that.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out. That's on Peacock stateside. I've been curious because there's been a lot of Hitman-esque movies and TV shows coming out. Even if you expand that to true crime, like based on a true story, The Flight Attendant seems to be very in right now. I didn't know it was based off of a book, though. I just figured it was one of those things where Peacock needed a series and they needed stars to be in that series, and they're like, "Hey, here you go."
It's so different though. I think it's an entirely different setting. The only similar thing is the idea of the jackal. So it's quite interesting how they adapted it.
Interesting. I'll have to catch up with that. The thing I would recommend that I don't think anyone can see right now because A24 kind of bumbled the release strategy for it when they bought it is Sing Sing. I think it's getting a re-release this week or next week in theaters in the United States. Coleman Domingo is one of the prisoners in Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York, and he's part of this program. He basically puts on plays and musicals, and it's all about the prisoners there, and uh, the actual prisoners at Sing Sing are in the movie. And I think it's based on a true story. Really great. It's got a really great ensemble cast. It's Coleman Domingo's as great as ever. You say Coleman Domingo, I'm sold. Especially the new Spider-Man show he's going to be in at the end of the month, but as Norman Osborn. That'll be interesting. But yeah, Sing Sing, if you can get out to see it, if your theater's playing it, I fully recommend it. Bring tissues, though. It's really sad towards the end. It's not a hopeful movie, despite its name. Well, I guess Sing Sing is more about the correctional facility than singing, but it is funny, I promise. There's a joke near the end with one of the characters, Divine E, I think is his name, makes a joke that I won't spoil here, but it made me laugh probably harder than some of the comedies that were released last year.
It's really good.
I only wish I'd seen it in theaters. I saw it in the Spirit Awards screening room. Let's talk about Wicked. I feel like we've got a lot to talk about, but first, I want to hear from you because you told me on our WhatsApp chat that you've seen the musical. So I want to hear a little bit about your experience coming into this as somebody who saw the musical and presumably has seen The Wizard of Oz.
I love the musical. I actually saw it three times in London.
Mhm.
So yeah, I'm a bit obsessed. It's one of my favorite musicals. I think it's also the first ever musical I saw in theaters. I also really like The Wizard of Oz. Even before I got into Wicked, The Wizard of Oz was just one of my favorite films. really ever. And the book too. I didn't read the Wicked book, but I read the Wizard of Oz book. So that's always been a part of my childhood, especially the Wizard of Oz. I read it lots of times. I've seen it countless times because it's such a wonderful movie. I studied film at university, and obviously you watch that, I think, in every film course. So it was also interesting to see it with the historical background and context, especially from a technical point of view with Technicolor. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating and evergreen as a film. But talking about Wicked in particular, I have always been a big fan. I think it's one of those musicals that only theater kids know and love. Other musicals like Hamilton are more, maybe a bit more
Mainstream.
mainstream, but Wicked is like, oh, you're one of us. It really feels like that. And it's always been such a big thing for me. Every time I watch it with a different cast as well, I've always enjoyed seeing different renditions of the songs, or even just online. Obviously, the Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth versions are iconic, and I think we all know them. It's for me, it's one of those musicals where it's really fun to see what the actors choose to do. I was very excited to see the film for that as well.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the musical, even though I love musicals. I'm a big Sondheim fan. Into the Woods is one of my favorite musicals. But yeah, I never got the chance to see Wicked. I think it was never playing near me, so I never got the chance. Maybe I'll talk about it a bit later in the podcast, but I really wish I had, because I feel like I missed some context in this movie for things that were going on. That was kind of a wink and nod to the people that had seen the musical. But yeah, I hadn't seen the musical prior to seeing the movie. I went out and saw it with friends. And obviously I've seen Wizard of Oz. I think I saw that pretty early on as a kid. And even, somebody growing up in the early 2000s, I was like, okay, this whole Technicolor thing was a big deal. And I think it does a really great job at portraying that technological advancement, even to somebody who's like, oh yeah, I've always had color films. Um, it made it part of the story, which it's not like my favorite movie of whenever it came out. I think 1950s, maybe earlier. I might be getting my release history wrong, but yeah, it's up there for me. Now, I haven't read the books either, but quick disclaimer for those who are reading the books, if you have kids, don't let them read the books because I've seen enough videos on TikTok about the Wicked book that, oof, it's not for kids, despite having the new cover for the movie on it. Let's just say some eyes wide shut type things happen in the book. So I hear from TikTok at least. But yeah, that's about my history with it. I'd seen maybe Wizard of Oz when I was on cable once, and this is my first exposure to Wicked. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from for this. I really just want to hear from you because I think it's made for both audiences, but also more towards, hey, if you've seen
Hmm.
the musical, you'll really enjoy it. I think that's a perfect opportunity to talk about your expectations for the film adaptation. What were you expecting?
I think my expectations were quite high. Every time something you really love gets adapted, there's always like a sort of protectiveness that comes with it.
Mhm.
And I think it's really hard if you're a fan before to also judge it with a bit of distance in the sense that I think if you're a big fan of something, you have to allow for change, be aware that things are going to change for the film format, and that's more than normal. That's okay. But I think it's really hard to have that perspective. So in a way, I was trying to keep my expectations relatively low because it's not going to be like a sort of the exact same of the stage version, and it shouldn't be either because it's a different thing, and I think that's really hard to accept. But I had high expectations as well because I really like John M. Chu. I love Crazy Rich Asians. I think it's such a brilliant film. So when I heard he was the director of Wicked, that felt like the perfect combination for me. It's a director that I love. He also did musicals. He did In the Heights, which I also love. It just felt like the universe was giving me this gift, and so I have to say, I was expecting quite a high standard in terms of adapting a musical, but I was also keeping an open mind in the sense of how many things are going to change. Also, because it's split in two, so it was obvious that there were going to be new things. And I think that's also kind of the beauty of an adaptation because we don't want to see the exact same thing.
Yeah, I think you perfectly explained my expectations going into any Spider-Man movie. Like, I don't expect it to be, 50-year-old, like, circle eyeglasses Peter Parker all the time. As for my expectations, I love John Chu. I'd seen, like you said, Crazy Rich Asians in the theater and then In the Heights on then HBO Max, now just Max. And I think I love both of those, especially In the Heights. I don't remember what guilds I was in at the moment, but I voted for In the Heights like crazy the year it
Oh,
came
I
out.
love that.
I found an excuse to put it in. So I had really high expectations because the In the Heights soundtrack was on repeat all the time. Yeah, it's just a fantastic musical. So I really high expectations, even as somebody who hadn't seen the musical. So yeah, really high expectations that maybe shifted, and maybe we can talk about this later, or we can talk about it now. They kind of shifted when Universal announced it was going to be split into two halves, because as somebody who hadn't seen the musical or any footage for this movie whatsoever, I was like, okay. Usually, and we had just seen, I think this was at a time when Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning was just
Hmm.
out and bombed really, at least for me. At least for me. I won't speak for anyone else. It was bad. I fell asleep multiple times. So at the time, I'm like, oh, can he not pull this off? Is this going to be the one where it's just the material is too big for him? I got really worried when it was, going to be Wicked Part 1 and Wicked Part 2. I didn't have the context you have. That there's very clearly a cutoff
Yeah,
point, but we'll talk about the cutoff point later, specifically that cutoff point. But yeah, what were your thoughts on splitting in half?
I do agree that it was kind of boring. I think for me, mostly because whenever they split something in half, it feels like it's just a way to make money. It feels like it's about, oh, how much can we extend this rather than is it actually the best thing for the story? And it made me go back to all the Hunger Games, part one, part two, and Harry Potter and Twilight, and everybody was doing that. I think for me, what was worrying more than splitting into two was the runtime. Like, the
Yeah,
part one is basically as long, if not longer, than the whole show. I think Wicked is a relatively short musical. When we talk about musicals, there's significantly longer ones. And so it was like really weird to me because first of all, I was like, how are they going to do it with the song? I don't think there was an idea of having original songs yet. So I was worried about that. They're not going to fit because it's going to be over the music. At the same time, though, I think if you have to split something into two, you have to do it with a theater play. Like, it makes the most sense. It's already built in because there's an interval in a play, and especially musicals. So it really makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time, though, you have to be aware that the break is a 20-minute break, not a year break.
yeah,
I think that's something we're gonna have to see how they deal with in part two. That's something that I hope they kept in mind because it's all well and good when a break is already established in terms of when you break, what the beginning of the new part is. That's already written for you. But you really have to be careful, remembering that the audience in the theater has seen whatever happened 15 minutes before. They just went out or got a drink. But obviously for the movie, it's going to be very different. So that's quite exciting, I think. I am really curious to see what they do, but also slightly concerning.
but you made me think of two things I want to bring up. I talked about Into the Woods earlier. I think you had a really good point about intermission. When Disney made their 2013 adaptation of Into the Woods with Chris Pine, Anna Kendrick, and all the big stars, I was kind of upset that there wasn't like an hour long intermission or, 20-minute intermission. The movie keeps going. But as we both know, in Into the Woods, there's a very natural stopping point when it hits intermission. I haven't seen Into the Woods in a while, so correct me if I'm wrong. There's a big time jump where the kids become adults. So I think that's an interesting point to bring up about the intermission, it being a year, almost exactly to the day, because it's like, what are we going to have a previously on Wicked when we go for Wicked
Are
for
we?
Good? Turn on Peacock when it comes to streaming. Is that going to be integrated? It's going to be interesting to see how they handle that because, again, I no context other than things that got spoiled for me on TikTok about the future of some characters. Basically, the second half got spoiled for me. I was just scrolling and I was like, why is there a
There's so many
whiteboard?
spoilers.
But yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how they handle that. And going back to expectation, I want to pivot back to Yana Grant because I think she was a big question mark, at least for me, because I know her music, or at least Eternal Sunshine. At least I know that. Her most recent album. I've seen people like Harry Styles go into acting, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But Ariana Grande, I know she was on Nickelodeon, but I hadn't seen any of that. Apparently, she was in Zoolander 2 or something like that. Essentially, didn't really have a lot of experience. What were your expectations of Grande taking on a character like Glinda/Glinda? What were your expectations for her not really having as much experience as Cynthia Erivo or Jeff Goldblum or anyone from the
I
cast?
agree. I think it was a bit not worrying, but it did raise a question mark for me as well because I think she did start out as a actor, but obviously in a very different context as a child actor, and she's mostly known for singing. I think, like you said with that Harry Styles, I think the concern is always like, are they choosing this person because they're famous and they're going to bring in a lot of fans, or are they actually choosing this person because they deserve it? I wasn't really sure. Obviously, Ariana Grande is a huge name, and I had personally never heard her sing anything but pop. So I think the concern was also, is she gonna be able to do musical theater? Obviously, she sings really well, she can carry a tune, but I think musical theater and specifically Wicked is so much different. It's different and it's perhaps a bit more complicated. You really have to study, know how to do certain things. You're not just sort of born with it. Of course, they're born with the talent, but it's a whole different background and preparation for it that I wasn't sure whether or not she had, especially compared to other people in the cast. We know they've done musical theater. So I was very unsure. And Glinda is such a big and iconic character. It's not like they gave her the little song because she's cool and famous. Its main part is one of, I think, the most famous like roles in musical theater or the most iconic ones. So I think she also had this kind of legacy to deal with, which, it's the same for Cynthia in that sense. Elphaba and Glinda are so associated with the people that originated it that I think it must have been really hard to come into their own. There's a fear of comparison with the original, but at the same time, as an actor, you don't want it to be the exact same as the people who had done it before. So I can't imagine the pressure in that sense, but I do think that is something people really had in their mind. Like, we all know the original cast
Yeah.
recording, right? So it's a lot to take on, especially, like I said, for Ariana, because she obviously wasn't known for that. And I think there was quite a lot of judgment and doubts over her casting, which fair enough. It does happen. But I think she proved me wrong because I wasn't sure. And then I left the theater. I thought she was amazing.
Yeah, and honestly, the only Ariana type thing I heard, there's a little three-tone note in Popular where it's like it sounds like something from Ariana Grande's song. It's like da 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 da. And it's just like that sounds like something of a sweetener. I just want to ask somebody, it was that intentional?
Yeah.
Because immediately I was like, wait, am I listening to the wrong album?
Yeah.
Because it sounds so much something like off a sweetener, but she gets into that high register where I was genuinely concerned for her voice, at least for No One Mourns the Wicked. Yeah, I think she did fantastically. She
Mm.
quelled my doubts almost immediately with that opening number. I was like, okay, I got you. I always equate it to her SNL performances because I think she took the comedy from that show, and you can kind of see it in her most recent SNL episode. She took the humor and infused all the snobbiness you'd imagine someone like Glinda would have, which I thought was fascinating. And interesting to explore that made it different enough where new people can come and connect with that. Oh, here's that snobby person that I, met in high school or something like that. But yeah, she quelled all my fears of a stunt casting, for lack of a better phrase. Other than that, let's talk about the other performers. Who stood out to you?
I think Ariana Grande really did. Maybe it's a question of expectations, but I think, like you said, from No One Mourns the Wicked, she was incredible. I could really see her being Glinda. Like, I feel like I didn't have that before. And then as soon as she started singing, I was like, oh, she's so Glinda. Like, she's just great. I think she makes the role her own, like you said, with the
Mhm.
comedy. She found a lot of moments that maybe I hadn't noticed before, for comedy, but she also found a lot of depth in the character, especially in Popular, which I think is usually a very funny song. Like, I remember every time I saw it in the theaters, people are just laughing for the whole thing. And her version is really funny as well.
Yeah.
I think she also managed to find some moments of reflection. It's this perfect combination between the two. She's a sort of like mean girl, but then she's also really funny and she's also really sweet. Like it's a whole package and she's great in it. She really stood out for me. But also Jonathan Bailey, I think he was brilliant. I really liked him since Bridgerton. But I didn't know he was that good. Like, I didn't know he could sing and dance as well. I also was lucky enough to see him in the theater. It was just a play, so he wasn't singing or dancing, but it was that was also a way to realize how good he is as an actor. And I think in Wicked he surprised me once again because he's just so good. I think Fiyero is a rather complicated character and we'll see more
Yeah.
of that in part two, but he goes through like a relatively big self-discovery journey. And I think he did that so well. He just looked at the camera and I knew, like, I was so happy. Obviously, ever since he was cast, I was very much in favor of him being Fiyero. I'm obsessed with his just rendition of Dancing Through Life. So
So good.
those two for me really stood out the most.
And that's probably the best scene out of the movie for me is Dancing Through Life.
Right, same.
I mean that's so immaculate. I watched a breakdown of the whole thing. I forget who did it. It was like Vanity Fair or somebody. But yeah, in terms of mine, I think I'll have to go with Ariana as well. I think she just floored me with how good, how just effortless it felt. At times, it didn't really feel like she was playing a character, which was really kind of surreal to me. I think Erivo does well, but I don't think she surprised me as much. If you've seen Cynthia Erivo in anything, you've seen her performance here. I
Mhm.
don't really think she tried anything new. I mean,
I
granted, she
agree.
makes Elphaba her own, 100%. Both of them make their own Elphaba and Glinda, but I felt like there could have been better choices made. But granted,
I agree.
I'm not in those production meetings. I know it takes a village to make a movie, and seeing the deleted scenes now that people are sharing on TikTok and YouTube, and I think maybe there was more of that in the first edit. So maybe that's not entirely on her, but she does have a great musical number in The Wizard and I. Just skip past the Madame Morrible stuff, and then it's a perfect song. Speaking of songs, what were your favorites? What were your standouts?
Ooh, I have to say Dancing Through Life. It's a great song, but I think the way they did it is so engaging and I loved it. And also like I seem to remember that Jonathan May did his own dancing and stunts, which is really impressive, also because they sang live. So I think that adds a whole other level to it. Love Dancing Through Life. I think it's also one of those numbers that reminded me the most of a show because there are so many extras, right? So it
Mhm.
sort of reminded me of like the ensemble. So those numbers for me are always really special because it's like what theater is. It's oftentimes not just one person singing on their own. It's a lot of people dancing perfectly at the same time, which is really impressive. Which I guess on a similar note, I really liked No One Mourns the Wicked. I think such a great beginning in general, but they did it so well. I liked how they sort of like obviously start with that. And then we'd go back in time and get that little montage. That was amazing. Maybe those two, I have to say for me. I love The Wizard and I, though, as a song.
Mhm.
But that's also because I just love the songs.
The song is the core of the movie, the musical, I
Hmm.
think. And you really start to see some of those motifs come in. You hear a bit of Unlimited in that song, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, it's a perfect song if you just cut out the Madame Morrible speaking
Oh
part.
God, yes.
And I think we could all agree on what the worst song is. Dear Old
I think we
Shiz.
can. But
I know
like,
it's
I feel
only
like that
30
was the case for
seconds,
the musical. It's too long.
but it's like, look, we have the girl spilling the tea in front of the Aussians. We're good. You don't need a whole song to intro. I forget what the next song is, but yeah, it's by far the worst song. And I actually like Sentimental Man. I know that's apparently a controversial
Oh,
opinion.
interesting.
And maybe if it was anyone else than Jeff Goldblum singing it,
Hmm.
I might have put that lower. Just
Yeah.
it's so
Oh,
one.
I think
But
he's
yeah,
great for the wizard. He's a really good choice, although not. I wasn't 100% sold on his vocals if we look at the vocal range for Sentimental Man, which admittedly I don't think is the best song in Wicked. But I think as an actor and especially for the comedy part of it, he's such a good choice for the wizard.
yeah, 100%. Do we want to take this opportunity to talk about some of the weird audio production issues with the songs?
I think we can.
I think the two I would love to talk about was the auto tune on Popular, and then I think it's during the end of No One Mourns the Wicked. when there's a gentleman caller,
Hmm.
and it just sounds the auto tune in that sounds weird. What's weird about listening to the soundtrack is it sounds better. It's a different mix. I couldn't hear the songs in the theater. Everyone was silent except for weird claps.
I would have
Yeah.
hated that.
I was looking around like, I mean,
Who's
I live in a
laughing?
boomer town, but it's like just like this isn't Broadway, right? You don't have to clap
Right.
each time. Yeah, it just felt weird. The auto tune felt overused. So that's really all I have to say about the audio production issues, and then obviously the mixing issues. But yeah, it's just weird for a musical to have audio production issues with someone who's it's the second musical, I think.
And I think as well, I'm not sure if In the Heights the singing was filmed live on set, but I know Wicked was. And when you make that choice, which I think the actors were very much in favor of, or maybe they even introduced it, but however it went down, I think when you make that choice, you have to be really careful because it's kind of obvious that then you're gonna hear the post-production on the sound even more. So I feel like that might have been a part of the issue because obviously it's harder and I'm not sure whether he's used to it or not as a director. Interesting, I have to say. And I think you're right though. If you listen to the soundtrack on Spotify, it's a lot better. Or it seems
Like
to be anyway.
miles.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it's gonna be like in the digital version whenever it comes out.
I'm waiting for that price drop.
God.
I've been hovering over that buy button for like what a week, and I'm just like, nope, you can't, nope, don't do it.
No.
So before we move on to spoil, I want to talk pros and cons. What did you like most? What didn't you like about this movie?
Oh, I love that. What did I like the most? I think some of the performance really stood out to me, even as someone who's listened to a million versions. All the ones that are out there, I've listened to them. I think it was fun to see, especially for Ariana Grande, such a new and exciting portrayal of a role that's timeless and has been done so many times. That's really exciting. I think as well, it was really exciting for me to see kind of like, I don't want to say like a more technical side of it, but like seeing Oz in such a way. Obviously, on the stage, you can't do so much. You can only do so much in terms of like special effects. And I think what was cool about the film for me was you get to see Oz or the palace in a much not more accurate, but like a way that makes you feel like it's that only film can do, obviously. I really enjoy that. And I also enjoyed as a musical fan and as a Wizard of Oz fan, all the little Easter eggs. I feel like there's always more than I've noticed. Sometimes I think about it, I'm like, oh, that was also an Easter egg. Or like on TikTok, people point it out and it's so fun. So I really appreciate how they worked on putting those in. You can tell there was so much love for the original musical because you just feel it. Going on to things I didn't like, there are a few. I think it's obvious I hated Madame Morrible. I'm so sorry. Michelle Yeoh, I love you, but this was not it. Even she said, I think she said that when she got the role, she called John and she said, I can't sing. And she's right, she can't. I'm so sorry. It's so sad.
It's so bad.
It's so bad. I don't want to be mean, but surely anybody can learn how to carry a tune. That's just bad. And it's really sad because at least she's not the main character, but it's really sad because I always want to listen to The Wizard and and I've got that horrible bit, and it's like, just shut up. It's so sad because I think she's a brilliant actress. I really think this was a miscast. Even when she's not singing, I just didn't feel like her portrayal of Mother Morrible stood out to me in any way, which must have been really hard because she's on screen for such a limited time. And maybe it's gonna change in part two, God knows. But I really didn't like that choice. I appreciate that she's a great actress, but maybe this didn't work for her. It's really sad because one of the last things I saw her in was Everything Everywhere All at Once, where she's obviously amazing. And you're like, how can this be the same person? I really don't understand. But that I did not like. I also didn't like when in The Wizard and I, specifically, that there's a scene that really bothers me when she's running around and she's like in this field. And I was like, what is this? That took me out
Yeah.
of the thing so much. It doesn't make any sense. It felt very weird to me. It was kind of like a tonal disconnect with the rest of the song. I loved when she was running around. And then she's in this field, and I'm confused. That I really disliked. I thought it
Security
was
guard?
such an odd choice. Like, what is going on? Why is there a tunnel that leads to a field in the middle of nowhere?
Cliff.
What? To a cliff? That was so silly. And it felt like, for me, it felt like it made no sense with what I had imagined the geography to be. I think when you do something like The Wizard of Oz and these kind of magical realms that people are attached to one way or another, you have to be like relatively at least consistent with yourself. Like you're establishing shiz to be like however big and wherever in this map. You have to stick to that because people are going to overanalyze this. I
People
didn't
have.
appreciate that. People have. So I did not appreciate that at all. But oh, I also forgot one thing I loved was the little cameos. I don't want to say who, but they were
Yeah.
cool. Look out for a cameo. It's great.
We could talk about that in spoiler discussion. I think I have basically the same pros and cons as you. It's interesting because, and I mentioned this in my first post of 2025, I think. I've edited it 5 times, so I don't know what exists in it now. But I talk a little bit about how when I left the theater, Wicked was a good, not great movie for me. I was like, okay, it's a good movie, it's a good musical. But then the more I was exposed to it, it became top 20 of the year for me, which is kind of interesting because that doesn't happen a lot for me. This made me rethink my review process. I think our and cons are the same, although I think this needed an extra 30 minutes. I know it's long, but especially with Elphaba and Galinda's connection, I think really suffers in this movie to just being cut to essentially a montage. I don't think that's a spoiler for anyone. It's literally like a 5 minute thing for me, how they connect and some stuff. The story just feels so truncated. And maybe that gets alleviated in part two slash for good, whatever they're calling it this week, which I hate the title, but that's the topic for November of this year. I know they're the Easter egg part of it. But yeah, I loved it otherwise. I also think Madame Morrible is horribly miscast. I loved Peter Dinklage.
Hmm.
I loved how much the plot made you think about what's actually going on in Oz rather than just what's happening between these two characters. Because I think that's the way to get people like me who had never seen the musical to really connect with the film is okay, show me what the political situation is in Oz. However, non-interesting that may seem, especially to a Star Wars prequel fan like myself. And, you know, it made the mundane interesting. And I want to talk about something, but I can't talk about it till spoilers. I'll leave that till our spoiler discussion. But yeah, those are my pros and cons. Can't think of anything else that's a con other than I think some characters, the side characters, like Peter Dinklage and oh, she was in Greatest Showman, the actress there. I think those two people
Oh
and Madame
yeah, she's
Morrible
great.
horribly utilized in the film. I think they
Yeah.
needed again, I this all relates back to the extra 30 minutes. If I'm already in the movie theater for 2.5 hours,
Might as well
tack on
make it
30 minutes
three.
because I think the worst part of a long movie is having a long movie that feels like it needs to be longer. And I think that was my problem with Dead Reckoning too, was that if you just tack on another 30 minutes, you don't need a part two. You can finish this up real fast. You don't need a Dead Reckoning part two, or I think it's called the Final Reckoning now.
Is it actually? Oh, that's quite
Yeah.
funny to me.
Yeah, they removed the part one and part two from them because it bombed so bad. But I mean, you went up against Oppenheimer. What did you expect?
What did you expect, really?
Yeah, those are my pros and cons. Gut feeling for this would be a 4 out of 5
Same.
because I do think there are structural problems that I don't think make it help it stand on its own. It really is kind of propped up by what will happen in part two. And I keep saying part two, and I will die on this hill. But the beginning credits say Wicked Part One. You should have just named it Part Two, or Wicked, or something. Just don't do the Part One if you know it's the second one's going to be called For Good. Anyways, that's my rant about the titles.
Agree.
And I guess Fiyero's fine in it. Jonathan Bailey's fine in it. Jonathan Bailey's always good. I'm probably taking a good thing for granted. But what is your rating?
And it's also 4 out of 5. I do agree. I think there are problems. Some of them quite significant. The good outweighs the bad in the sense that coming from it with like the background of the show, it's a lot easier to adjust to certain things and know
Mm.
what is going to happen and why are we seeing that now. So I think I felt that a little bit less. But It's good. I think it's a generous four because I generally love the songs, but it is a 4 out of 5.
I like that description, generous for, because it is like teetering towards 4.5, but they don't make an emoji for half a star, so maybe I can make an apple emoji of a half star.
Or like
Um,
a little sparkle.
yeah, little sparkle. So that's our general discussion. So for those who haven't seen Wicked yet, we're about to go into detail about everything. Spoilers. We're going to talk about the plot. We're going to talk about any questions we have about the movie. So if you want to avoid spoilers, you can skip ahead to a chapter that's marked either final thoughts or social media plugs in the episode's description on YouTube or your favorite podcast service. And I'll also have those on Patreon as well. So let's get into what 90% of our discussion is going to be about spoilers. So let's talk about Elphaba's journey in this movie. How did you feel? How well was that portrayed for you? Her transformation from Elphaba to the Wicked Witch of the West.
I liked it. I thought it made a lot of sense because the film and even the musical to a certain degree focuses so much on her kind of relationship with the talking animals. I think perhaps it's a bit predictable in the sense that you can see it play out about halfway through the film. Maybe because I knew, but I think it makes sense. I could see the beats to it and the way she gets there, even though I knew it was happening all along. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because after all, it does begin with No One Mourns the Wicked. But I think in the film, it's perhaps even a bit more accentuated, like specifically her relationship with the talking animals. I
Yeah,
think, and it would be really embarrassing if I'm wrong, but I think that in the musical, when Elphaba is born in No One Mourns the Wicked, I don't think they're animals, the people that look after her, and then when there's the whole flashback scene, that she's shown kindness by them. I don't think that's in the musical at all. So I really appreciated how that was brought in from her childhood
mhm.
and then obviously continued when she went to Shiz. But that made so much sense to me. And it really made her journey even more worth it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. It almost kind of leans more into the discussion the film wants to have about propaganda. I guess I'm kind of jumping throughout the film here, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about that. Elphaba first arrives at Shiz. She destroys the emblem, uh, and the emblem behind it is full of animal. There's a whole discussion the film wants to have about that too, which we will talk about. But yeah, I think it was a nice kind of tie-in, the new backstory. Because I think you said I don't think that existed in the musical because, and I think I've heard a lot of people say that is that there's things that make it more cohesive, and I actually really appreciate that as somebody coming in not knowing anything other than, hey, this is a sort of spin-off of The Wizard of Oz or a prequel or something. But yeah, I really appreciated that having that context. In fact, in the back of my mind, when I saw the bear, I was like, is that Paddington's mom? I really did enjoy that added backstory because I think it'll help later in part two, given the things I was spoiled, how that backstory relates back in part two. I won't spoil that for people who haven't been spoiled on TikTok to a whiteboard explanation. I'll be honest, I thought it was just an explanation of who's who. You know, and granted, she said spoilers in the middle of it. I should have just clicked off, but it's TikTok. I was like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
interested in this. But I really did enjoy that backstory, Glinda, which you can use either one because she spends most of the movie as Glinda, and then in the ultimate self-serve way to honor Peter
Him.
Dinklage. I'm gonna change my name to Glinda. I also think that served their relationship too, because their relationship is one of classism, which is an interesting discussion to have in what is ostensibly what Warner Brothers wants to be a family film. But there are so many things of like, oh no, Glinda is rich. She doesn't have the problems Elphaba does. And Elphaba comes from, yes, her dad, the governor, is rich, but she was never given those resources. And then she also has her sister, Nessa Rose, who is in a wheelchair, and she's got to care for her. I just thought all of it, coloring in between the lines, was so fascinating. Since I'm already broaching on the whole Glinda Elphaba relationship, I'd love to know what was different from the stage musical to the film adaptation and how that relates to this.
I think for me, Wicked has always been a story about friendship. I think the whole thing has always been like Glinda and Elphaba and the love between them. Now I know there's a discussion about do they love each other. I not talking about that. I don't care if they're gay, they're not. That's not the point. I think the point is like two people that care so much for each other, but they're so different. To me, that's the core of everything that Wicked is. I am not sure how well it came out in the movie. Like obviously you can see it,
Hmm.
but I think for me, it's stronger in the show. And I think it's because in the film, we have so much backstory on Elphaba and, and Nessa as well, to some extent, that it feels like we spend a lot more time on that than on Glinda and Elphaba.
Hmm.
Even though, if you compare songs and scenes, it might be the same in the musical, but because of the other stuff, it feels like there's less. And I think that's a shame because to me, that is the core of everything. That's how Wicked begins. Like, it's Glinda remembering her friend. And the whole story, I think specifically from Glinda's perspective, is about how friendship can change you and change your life. And it's beautiful. I have to say, though, I think some of it is done quite well. I think Dancing Through Life, like at the end when it comes in, it's so beautiful. I cried. It was so sweet.
I'll be honest, I didn't understand that moment. I thought, what are we doing? Are we doing
What is
interpretive
happening?
dance now? I still don't understand that. I need a
Like a
PhD
full brain.
scholar to explain that. Literally right before she gives her the famous hat that Glinda hates, like, oh, now all of a sudden you're besties? Okay.
It did feel a bit rushed, and to me also the shame was that I felt she only did it because Elphaba had just done her a favor. But the beauty of that moment is how she's willing to lose the most important thing for her, which is like the respect or the way people think of her and her popularity for somebody who's relatively unpopular and not seen very well. That was the beauty of it, the way she's willing to risk what she thinks matters the most for her friend. But I do think it was rushed because one minute they hate each other and then you're like, What's going on?" I think especially from Elphaba's side, it was quite rushed because in What's This Feeling in the movie version, she really hates Glinda and why shouldn't she? But
Yeah,
it
you
feels
just made
like
me remember that song. And I was like, oh yeah, the book thumping song. I really love that song.
yes, that one. It's great. The choreography is really good for that one, I think. But it felt like we went from there where they can't stand each other to besties. And for Elphaba specifically, it just felt like all that was needed was Nessa Rose being like, oh, she's actually really nice. So that's quite odd. And given how long the film is, you would expect it to be a longer transition to get there because if you know the story of the musical, you would know that's where it's going. But that's one of the things I was hoping to see when I heard about the runtime. I was hoping that they would give it more time. I do think there are some deleted scenes because was it Jonathan Bailey? I think he was like, "Oh yeah, I had to shoot without my shirt on," and people were like, where does that fit, first of all? But second of all, that does indicate some deleted material that might have expanded on their friendship. I don't know.
So, okay, I've seen three of the deleted scenes. The one he's talking about is
Oh,
some kind of picnic scene between
I thought it was
Bach.
the picnic scene.
Yeah, a picnic scene between Bach, Elphaba, Glinda, and Elphaba. I'm guessing it happens after What Is This Feeling? That's what I'm
Oh, that does
guessing.
make sense.
Like after the montage, there's a scene where, as Elphaba is getting to leave for Oz, Bach talks to her, uh, and they just kind of have an earnest conversation about, do you really love Nessa Rose? You know, you need to be honest with her. So that's two of the scenes. I can't remember what the third was off the top of my head, but I know there's a lot of scenes that take place on that train. I feel like a lot was cut out of that contextualizing the relationship between Elphaba and Glinda. What I really love to see, which kind of goes back to my, 30-minute comment earlier in the podcast. 3 hours, fine, do it. 3.5, sure, why not? The
Not
Brutalist
commit.
is almost 4 hours, so why not?
And it's fantastic.
I still need to see that, by the way. It's in the screening room. I'm gonna get to it. I would be interested to see, and I think they're gonna release an extended cut of Wicked Part 1. be, based on how many people have talked about, oh, this should have been in the movie. One studio that loves to do extended cuts is Warner
So
Brothers. There's this huge gap between the digital and the Blu-ray release, and there's not even a sign of a Peacock release yet. Or I guess it would be Max, because Warner Brothers. I think an extended cut might be what be looking for, or the Oz cut, or whatever they end up calling it. But yeah, a lot feels cut out of that cent middle of the movie.
that might be interesting because it might actually develop the friendship more if we get to see understanding. I do wonder how much of what was cut was actually Elphaba and Linda specifically.
Yeah, for sure. They've got an hour of extras. I don't know how many
Hmm.
of that is deleted scene. Eh, but yeah, I'd be interested to see the deleted scenes. So whoever is distributing the thing, if you want to
Is
give me a free copy, that'd be great. There's a lot there that you could definitely expand on. But let's talk about the two characters that get the least screen time, Madame Morrible and the Lizard. What were your expectations, and how did their roles differ for you from the Broadway musical?
I think the wizard I really liked his sort of like the whole thing that Jeff Goldblum brings to the wizard. I think it's brilliant. And without giving too much away, I think it sets up quite well for part two and what we'll see of him because I think his portrayal makes you think there's a lot more under the surface, and that might be true. So I think it's quite fascinating in that sense. And in how he embodies the character in the movie version, I think we get to see maybe a lot more of the nuances already. I didn't particularly like his singing choices or his rendition of A Sentimental Man. I don't think it's very memorable to me.
All it needed
Um,
was harmonica.
that maybe could have changed things for the better. But hey, at least he was good in the role. I think he's a good choice for the wizard. Madame Morrible, however, is not. There's nothing that stands out in the way she portrayed Madame Morrible to me, and she's quite important plot-wise for Elphaba and for the future of Wicked. That I think it's really weird that she's the least memorable character of the whole film to me. I also think she could have been a lot more nuanced. I feel like she's in the movie to me, she comes out as this very flat villain. Not even an interesting villain. She's just a boring villain. In the musical, it's a lot more nuanced. Does she actually care for Elphaba? Does she want her to develop this power? What does she want? And in the movie, I don't think you even ask yourselves those questions because you're so distracted by the fact that she can't sing. It bothers me. This is a musical. At the same time, though, I was talking to someone about this, and they made a good point. It feels like every movie adaptation of a musical has to go through this and have one actor that can't sing. So maybe it was needed after all.
I think there was somebody in the Heights that I was just like, oh, they cannot sing. I forget who it was. Maybe Jimmy Smits. Maybe that's who it was.
Yeah, who was it?
I'll have to go and do my research. But yeah, I totally agree. The wizard is this sleazy man, right? At least in this interpretation of it. In sly ways too, which I think we'll get into a little bit more. I think I wanted Jeff Goldblum to be less Jeff Goldblum in this. I love his affectations and all that, but I don't believe that this is a sleazy guy. It,
Hmm.
I can't say that because that's a real spoiler for part two. Mm,
Oh, damn. I think I know.
you know what I'm talking about.
I know. I know what you mean. He just feels like Jeff Goldblum. He doesn't feel like the
Yeah,
wizard.
yeah,
That's the thing with him, though, I think.
yeah. Like you don't hire Jeff Goldblum if you don't want Jeff Goldblum. And I think Michelle Yeoh just feels like a 1990s mummy-esque villain. And by mummy, I mean the Brendan Fraser mummy trilogy, especially Scorpion King, like that era of villains. And so I think I agree with you on that. I need more time with them. I feel like their appearances are maybe 15 minutes each, if
Hmm.
that. And for people who are central to the story, again, I'm really tiptoeing around that part two spoiler. Um, but it just feels like their presence is more omniscient, especially
Hmm.
when you get into Oz, with One Short Day, um, and they have that presentation. It just feels like this wizard is an idea, and when you get to actually meet him, it's like okay, which I guess is kind of the point.
I
Like
think
there's
that the wizard kind of fits with the Wizard of Oz and what we know from that, but I do agree for Madame Morrible, it's not a good choice. She's so important to what Shiz and to the story that it's so odd that she's not in it longer.
well, and she's the core conflict point for Elphaba and Glinda.
Mm,
Wants that spot to be. She came to Shiz to be in
yeah.
that class, and then she's rebutted, and it's just like demoralizing for her.
Mm.
And then Elphaba, a total nobody from her perspective, gets in because she made some chairs fly. Um, I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, the chairs just fly. It's like if I was Madame Morrible, I'd be like, okay, we made chairs fly. What do you do? I, I would just hand her the grimoire and be like, all right, let's see you do actual magic. I just think they need more time. And maybe that's
Hmm.
something that I think is a criticism that could be alleviated by For Good or slash Part Two, because I know they have very big roles in that. John Chu, if you're listening, you can still recast Michelle Yeoh. You can throw
Please.
you can throw Hannah Einbinder. You could just totally or somebody or
Or
Hannah
anyone,
Waddingham.
really.
That's really all I gotta say about the Wizard and Madame Morrible. Let's talk about the themes without trying to get into the part two spoilers. Um, so there's a lot of political themes, propaganda that starts even from minute one when
Mhm.
Galinda arrives and you realize the bubble is actually a mechanical device, not something Galinda is using magic, which I thought was a nice touch. And the Shiz emblem being destroyed and the whole subplot with the animals. There's a lot to discuss here. What did you think about those political themes, particularly the treatment of animals in Oz and the propaganda and all of it?
I agree. I think it's really fascinating how they brought it in from the very beginning. It's a lot about friendship, but also propaganda and the political part of it. I think it feels especially relevant to me, because it came out in November 2024. The timing could have been more perfect in a sad and interesting way. A film on powerful white men using propaganda to his advantage is quite fitting, and it's very interesting how that came to be. It's also interesting to me how a musical made so long ago, Wicked, like it's not a new musical,
20 years old,
is
right?
so relevant to today. That's crazy to me, and I love it, but it's also a little bit sad how the political discussion that it explores is even more relevant now, if you can make that claim. It's especially also for the animal part. I think part two is going to reveal a lot more of that, but you can see
Mhm.
how this is a really crafted version of reality that the wizard is trying to push. And I
Yeah.
think it makes you rethink the whole Wizard of Oz in that sense as well. How much of what we hear is true and how much is just like sort of put there to make us believe. I thought that was so interesting. I think maybe it comes out a bit more in the movie rather than the musical. It's there from the very beginning, and it's also like the talking animal parts, I think, is a lot more present with the whole like sort of storyline on that. I think we get to explore it a lot more, which makes it more interesting because it feels like the stakes are so much bigger than just two people and what happens to them. It's a whole sort of like belief system. And I really appreciated that because it makes it feel so much bigger, so much more important. It's not just Elphaba that you care about, it's everything that she stands for. If she fails, it's not about her. It's
Yeah.
about every single talking animal and the future of Oz, really, and how do you want that to look like? So I really enjoyed that. I think they did a really good job at kind of like bringing it in, but without being too much. You know how like sometimes you feel like they're pushing things down your throat, and I think this film is a good way to show that you can be political, but you don't have to be too on the nose. Even if the intention had been to make a commentary on today's politics and it fits really well, it's not too obvious. Sometimes it's annoying when they make comparisons and you're like, I could have guessed that. You didn't need to spell it out for me.
Yeah.
I think Wicked does it really well. You can draw the comparison yourself, but you can also just enjoy the film. even if my comparison to today is such a big part of it.
Yeah, and I mean, this ties in with what I was talking about earlier. During the one short day, you get this whole performance of the 100%, what did they say? The 100% true story of Oz. I didn't realize this that after I saw the film and, swiped through some TikToks. TikTok, you really helped figure some stuff out for me about the movie, by the way. Uh, don't take it from us, please. Um, is that when the wizard is reading the Grimoire, he says Omaha, Omaha, Omaha. So, oh, maybe that's an actual thing from the Grimoire. But then I'm like, wait, no, Omaha, Nebraska is where the wizard comes from in the established lore.
Yeah, that's so cool.
That's the reason why he has the um hot air balloon.
hmm
Is because he literally got whisked away on a hot air balloon from Omaha, Nebraska. That was one of those eye-opening moments that I was just like, oh wow, this is really interesting. Um, to even dig into after the fact, right? So yeah, I think there was a lot, just the hot air balloon, Omaha, Nebraska thing, and it's interesting to see how he's crafted this world of pure fascism or just heightened propaganda to the point that nobody knows up from down,
Yeah.
which I just thought was interesting. Even down to that simple moment of the chair hitting the Shiz University emblem, and oh, there's animals. And that kicks off. Oh, there's something to this animal discrimination thing. Oh, Dr. Dillamont, that's his name. Uh,
Yes, that is his
um,
name.
there's something to this whole like message that somebody wrote on his uh chalkboard, but what would you call that? Chalkboard?
Sure.
And I think it was like written in blood or something.
Yeah.
It was weird. But I think we'll see more of that in part two slash for good. And I'll be really interested to see how that's integrated. In fact, I think I know who did that little message person from
That's interesting because a lot of people were discussing it on TikTok specifically.
yeah, I think it's the person from The Greatest Showman on behalf of Madame Morrible.
Interesting.
Because she's all about
Oh, I'd love to
control.
see that.
And so is the wizard. They're about control and it just oppressive control. I'd be interested to see if I'm right. But yeah, I can't talk about this next one because that's a part two spoiler.
I was like, yeah, that's a bit spoiler.
What do you think about Fiyero as a character without spoiling what happens in part two and how there's this awkward love square with him, Bach, Elphaba, and Galinda?
Yes, Hero. I really like this portrayal. I think for me, it sort of maybe went even deeper than the musical, or maybe because I really like Jonathan. But I'll admit I'm biased here, but I think it was really cool how we really get to see, I think, his character development already, which without spoilers is gonna happen in part two as well. For me, it really made sense how he went from A to B in this film. Like he starts out as this like not so bright, uh, very privileged guy. And I really enjoyed seeing the transition to somebody who maybe is not so stupid and maybe does care more about the war than he lets on. And I think his portrayal really made me think about the character's upbringing, like what that must have been like. And obviously, like, he's not the main character. This is not his film. We're not going to see that. But I think for an actor to make you really wonder about the character's backstory, and it all makes sense to me in what I imagine Fiyero to be. I think he did such a brilliant job. He also has chemistry with everything and everyone in that film. It's insane. And I think that's very Fiyero as well. That was a side of the character that I really enjoyed seeing, especially in this. And fantastic how that's portrayed, especially on the screen. In the theater is harder to see, especially when the audience is sitting far, far away, you notice the nuances a little bit less, unfortunately. And I think for me, that was really enjoyable to see. But I don't want to spoil too much. I think this sort of character development is mirrored by his relationship with Glinda and his relationship with Elphaba. It's like who the ward wants him to be and who he actually finds out to be. And it's so cool to see. And I think that's why for me it never felt like a love story, because I think for Fiyero, these two people are representative of where he is in his life and also sort of like the pressures of that. But I'm just really happy. I think it was such a good portrayal for the character. Before seeing the movie, I wouldn't think of Fiyero much. And now There's just a lot
It's a
to
poster
it.
on the wall.
Yeah, yeah. I'll replace that with Jonathan Bate playing Fiyero. I think that's quite appropriate with the horse. That was great. I loved how he's introduced as well.
I don't like comparing people, but I felt very Chris Pine Into the Woods, like just kind of like, oh hey, I'm the hero of this story, and then he gets to learn about the world, and I think it's not too dissimilar from what I'm assuming. I never went to college, but from what the average college student goes through when they come in from high school, and then they're like, "Oh, here's how the world actually works," and then they adopt that nihilistic kind of. Well, I don't want to say they. At least Fiyero adopts this nihilistic kind of point of view. You know, in dancing through life, he's like, nothing matters. Uh, and we're all gonna die someday. Then let's see, can I talk about this? Not, yeah, Elphaba and Fiyero save that lion cub, and then something changes. Pun not intended. It was an interesting arc. So maybe, yeah, maybe you're right in saying it's not entirely a love story. Maybe it's just one of discovery of I'm this prince.
Mhm.
Everyone does what I want. I'm just the party guy, but I want to learn more. I think we will learn more in part two. Oof. I don't want to give anything away,
It's hard.
but let's talk about. I'm just gonna skip over Bach, by the way. I'm sorry, Ethan Slater. I'm just gonna skip over you. I mean,
We're just gonna ignore that. I
yeah, we're
love how
gonna
we haven't mentioned him till now because like stroke it.
like. I don't want to give anything to the Arianators, the Ariana stands, but that's not the reason why. I just think he doesn't really do anything of this movie other than be confused about who we like. I want to talk about go back to Awe and talk about how it's represented in this movie. I think Elphaba says it's everything's grand and green. I think they say in One Short Day. Like, did it meet your expectations from the Broadway musical and from Wizard of Oz?
I think Oz during One Short Day really does live up to expectations. Everything is big, green, and fantastic, and it works really well for a movie. So you don't see half of that in the show. They do a really good job at doing a callback to The Wizard of Oz. Like I said, there's many Easter eggs. Like there's the whole bit with like the yellow brick road. Those are good moments to remind you where everything comes from. And it does feel like an extension of that world building wise. I was very happy with how Oz was portrayed. I think it does feel like Oz. It's what you want from like, this big magical capital. I think, especially compared to Shiz, which to me felt a tiny bit more underwhelming in that sense.
It felt like Hogwarts,
A little, I
smaller,
think
like
so.
low rent Hogwarts.
With both, which also there are in Harry Potter, actually, funnily enough. But I agree, it felt a bit derivative in that sense. And I also think because maybe they had like nothing to compare it to visually, because they did, obviously, because of Munchkinland to some extent. Because of The Wizard of Oz, the movie is best when it's like sort of recreating this scenery that we know very well, these visuals that I think a lot of people grew up with, but like with modern technology and in a whole entire different context. I really appreciated that. That was something I love seeing, especially on the big screen. I think it's just fascinating and beautiful to see. If we nitpick, the
Oh,
geography of
nitpick
it could have
away.
been a
That's
bit
what I'm known
better.
for.
That's what we're here for. Obviously, it's really hard, but I think the sort of geography of the whole thing could have been built better in terms of like world building. Like,
Yeah.
where is Oz? Where is Munchkinland? How are we relating everything? And Glinda's from like upland. What is the politics of this? I wish that would have been sort of like pushed a bit more. Is upland fancy and rich? And here is a prince. How does that fit? What is the hierarchy and societal structure of this place that has a wizard at the top and there's like prince and princes and governors and whatever? That's obviously not in the musical either, but if you do have to expand on stuff, for me that would have been really fascinating to see. But then again, I do understand this is not like Game of Thrones, so
I think it's too late to do this for the Blu-ray, but just have a bonus feature you can activate where it gives you the definition of things like Quatswood Tree, Upland, give you a
oh
little
my God, they have to
interactive
do it for
map.
me. And a little map, that would be so cool.
Yeah, tell me if Elphaba's dad is a personality hire. Is he just is he just signing documents all day? What does he do?
What's
Like,
happening?
because he's got money, but he's in this small house. What's going on? But he can afford a bear nurse thing. Like, what he has money. I don't understand. I need the lore. on
Yeah, exactly.
like, and I think they try to do that in Wizard and I when Elphaba's on
Hmm.
that cliff where you can see Oz in the
Okay.
background at the cliff that she could have just like died.
Hate that cliff.
When how it should have ended gets a hold of that, they're gonna, do a clip where she just runs off the cliff and just plummets to the into the chasm. I would have loved some lore. That would have been awesome. You know the thing Oz reminded me the most of? The original Asgard in the Thor movie. Everything was shimmering and beautiful to a detrimental amount in that movie, but that's a whole other discussion. Everything's just beautiful green and gold. I still think they should have picked the blue road. That looked better visually
Did
to me.
it? Maybe.
I mean, you've got enough yellow in Oz,
I would
but
opt for pink. I think a pink road would have been
ooh,
really cool.
that would have yeah, it looked red to me.
No, they should
But
have
I'm
done like
also a
a
little
sort of. I
colorblind
think they should have done a pastel pink, and in that case, Glenna would have picked it. It was not the right pink.
being part two.
Maybe part two.
She rebuilds a yellow brick road. Dorothy goes home and she's just like, I hate this color. Just as a Reno of the whole Oz.
Brick by brick.
But yeah, and I guess since we're already talking about Oz, we should talk about two very important citizens of Oz. Kristen Chenoweth and Idina Menzel appear in like a kind of stage play musical thing that is really funny. Even, I know that they were part of the musical. I was like, oh, this is just funny having no context for anything that's going on. But what did you think of that moment?
I loved it so much. I was lucky to not get spoiled because I saw Wicked like not like on opening day or in previews. I saw it like I think it was a week after release. So I did know they had been on set, but I didn't know it was for that. I was so happy. I didn't realize they were in the movie at all. So that was such a good surprise. And I think goes back to one of the ways that Wicked honored the sort of legacy of the musical. I loved it so much. I was literally like, jumping out of my seat. I was so happy when I saw them on screen, and what a good role to have them in as well, I think. I do admit that sort of like play within the play thing is could be a bit much potentially, and then it could feel a little like storytelling, expositionary vibes. But I loved it. I think partially because they're in it and partially because it's done quite well and interesting to see. It was so much fun to choose the two people who originated these iconic roles for that. I know that John M. Chu talked about just having them in general, and at first he didn't know how or where they would fit. He said at one point they were going to be Galinda's parents when they leave her that shiz. But he also spoke about like how when he realized that they could have been in this role, like everything felt right. Obviously, I would have been happy to see them in anything, but this feels perfect for them and just for what the legacy of the Wizard of Oz is. So I was really happy. I loved that moment. I think what made it for me was that I didn't expect it. So if, you know, if it can not be spoiled, I think that would be best. I know a lot of it, like a lot of Wicked is being spoiled, but that's the one thing
A
that
lot of
I
Wicked is being spoiled.
so much. It's insane.
Like even by
I hate.
Cynthia Erivo herself.
Oh God, bless her. I do. Yeah, God bless. She's trying. This press door, it's doing things.
We're just
But
holding
I think
space.
we are holding space. I think that's like the one thing that I would try the hardest to keep hidden because it's so much fun when you don't expect it as well. And I think it makes this whole moment that could be a bit like much and it could feel too much. Such a joy to sit through it, basically.
Yeah. They get a little riff off in there. It's nice. We know you're a Broadway act. We know you're on Broadway. All right.
Calm down.
But that was fun, even not having the context. And I think Steven Schwartz is a guard in Oz.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's so fun.
I think he introduces them to the wizard.
Hmm.
Like the wizard will see you now.
Yeah.
He gets that part. And those are the three I noticed. I think there was somebody else in that little stage play, but I don't know who it would have been.
It feels like the perfect time to throw something like that.
It's the point of the third act of exposition. Here's everything you need to know about the Wizard of Oz before
Yeah.
meeting the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Maybe you do the Upland personality hire thing in there too, if you really wanted to stretch it out, if you really wanted to like just have a 20-minute stage play. I heard people say it was a good time to go to the bathroom.
If you had to pick any, but No.
What did other people say? A sentimental man, you can just leave.
Oh yeah, no, that's the moment I would go to the toilet is a sentimental man, I have to say.
But in terms of visuals, I don't think the CG is all that great.
Oh, it's not great.
Like there are moments where I'm like looked at that, I'm like, oh, that needs a few more hours to bake in the oven and put it back in Maya, just re-render it, just something because like especially the train. I know it's like a practical thing
Mm,
because you see like or at least the outside is because I saw like set photos that showed it, but it looks so fake.
it does. It's such a shame.
And also going back to your thing of lore, you mean Glinda had Dorothy walk with little red slippers all the way up and down the yellow brick road when there was a train?
But that's funny to me because, like, again on TikTok, somebody was like, not Galinda being petty and making her walk when she could have taken a train. And I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, like Belinda just is the ultimate petty Betty. Just like, oh, you killed no. Well, no, I'm not. That's going to be a spoiler. Nope, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say who Dorothy kills. Um, but
Well, have you
uh,
seen The Wizard of Oz?
well, specifically
Oh,
who?
well, yeah. I'll shut up
Yeah,
now.
I blame that one person with the whiteboard on TikTok. It's always the people with the whiteboards. They're always spoiling stuff for me. Stop it. Or people uploading Sonic 3 clips to put it back on track. Going a little bit backwards to the themes, do you think John Chu captured those dark themes well enough?
It's hard because to me, like, it feels like a lot of darker stuff is in part two of the musical. If we're talking about the musical specifically, then yes, because he did a really good job with the animal stuff. Also, like, of maybe not showing much of like the darker stuff and the more violent stuff, but it's hinted at enough that you understand. Like, you don't need to see what is
Yeah.
happening to the animals. So I think in that sense, yes. But from what I know from the actual Wicked book, that absolutely not. The Wicked book is insane, and I actually I've had it for a few years and I haven't read it yet, and I'm a bit scared now because, like you said earlier, I know a lot and it feels like a completely different thing. A lot darker. There's a lot of stuff happening in the book, especially in terms of the animals. It does explore a whole lot more. So, in that sense, no, because this is like the PG version of
Oh,
the
it
Wicked book,
is.
from my understanding.
It is rated G in comparison to the book.
Literally.
Like, oh my goodness. So for those of us who hadn't, I haven't read the book, but I heard about this moment. Again, I will reiterate, eyes wide shut moment happens in this. Like, there's a big orgy in the book.
Isn't that crazy? Like, what?
Like, I no,
I have so many questions, but also I don't want answers. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like,
I don't
what
want to.
is going on?
Yeah, I don't want to know what books that Gregory Maguire was reading when he was writing Wicked. That puts Book Talk to shame.
Oh,
The
yeah.
pages I
Oh,
read of
when
that.
Bookdog gets their hands on Wicked, which they have already, but
Mhm.
we will never hear the end of it.
But yeah, going back to the movie, I think it does very well. Just not having any context context for the last half, other than some photos that came out recently because the digital version's out. I guess we got to see a good look at Elphaba in her full garb of the Wicked Witch of the West costume, which is all blacked out and everything. But yeah, there were some genuinely horrific moments in Wicked Part 1, specifically concerning the animal. And I can't talk about that. I wish I could talk about it, but it's a part two spoiler. I'll just say, in terms of the whole Dr. Dillamont side plot, if that was 5 minutes longer, I don't think I would have been able to go throughout the entire rest of the film. I'll be like, this is too much. This is too
Hmm.
dark for me. Yeah, it gets very dark around that point, and thankfully it lightens up a little bit, but still, I mean, even in the ending, it reminds you how brutal Oz is. I mean, with the flying monkeys, with the um, wings sprouting out of their back,
That
like the
part was fantastic.
yeah, like
So like harrowing to watch, but so like well done.
yeah, it's just like you felt their pain, and it's like,
Hmm.
oh, this is really
It's a
yeah,
lot.
to a point where I almost would say I wouldn't take kids to this. Like, and when I say kids, I'm not talking about a 14-year-old. A 14-year-old's not going to look at a you know monkey growing wings and look at that like a scarring moment of their life. But show that to an 8-year-old, they're not going to
Yeah,
want
it
to
could be a
watch
bit
The Wizard of
traumatizing
Oz.
actually.
And that's how it's treated in the movie. It's a very traumatizing moment, even for Elphaba. I think it did well enough. I will have to see how much darker it gets in part two. Based on the cursory things I know about part two, it's gonna get dark, like real dark. Since we're already talking about the ending, let's talk about the cliffhanger. We're already talking about part two pretty much. Like it ends on that massive cliffhanger. It ends on Defying Gravity, which I correctly predicted that's where the movie would end as soon as I saw that first trailer and they were playing those notes. I was like, oh, I know that
Oh,
song.
that's the end.
That's the end. That's the only song you're playing during the trailer. That's exactly how it ends. Because I'd heard people talk about Defying Gravity being the show-stopping thing, quite literally. It ends there. How do you think it sets up for good? Were you satisfied, or do you want more? Obviously, there's a part two, so there's an obvious need there. Yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on the end.
I think it's the obvious choice to split is where the interval is, and it makes a lot of sense. I think it's a bit risky though, because The Fine Gravity is one of the most famous songs in musical theater, and the most famous song of Wicked. That was a selling point for audiences that didn't know the musical as well. So I'm wondering, like, what about part two? I feel like there's not as many sort of like big songs. I mean, there's amazing songs, but I think to the general public, they're not really known as much, maybe for good. Haha, where the title comes from. But I don't think it's nearly as sort of popular in that sense. So that's a really tricky choice, I think, from them. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense to end it there. I think narratively, that's where it should end. Thinking about where the plot goes in part two, I do think you're like, you really do want to learn more. And I think, without spoiling too much, I think there is a bit of a tonal shift in part two that feels appropriate after something like Defying Gravity and what we see in at the end of part one. I think it's a really good place to end it because part one feels like this really nice flashback. Their early adulthood, they were in university. It does feel, I think, like this transitionary period that is ending with Defying Gravity. And I think part two is where we step into a much more adult world with serious consequences. It's not just about who gets to take the class with Madame Morrible. It's a lot more than that. So that's why I think it's really good split. But at the same time, I think it's hard because part two relies so much on part one. And like I said, the audience is going to see it a year after. How much of that are we going to remember? I'm curious to see how many callbacks they're going to do to part one. Yeah, I think it's really tricky, but I'm really excited for part two because that's where things are happening. Part two is going to be a lot. And I think the first film sets up the whole thing really well. I think there's going to be moments in part two that are gonna make you go, oh, this is why they did that in part one. I hope there is. I think that's the best way they could play this. I have to say though, I feel like Defying Gravity was just a tiny bit underwhelming for me
It
because
was so underwhelming.
wasn't it? I feel like the CGI was so distracting. I mean she's great and she sings so well and I think she's doing her own stunts. But you look at that and you're like, what's that background? What's happening? It's so confusing.
And you're
And
flying
that's a
around the
shame.
castle. Nobody can hear you.
Like, what the hell? And also, I think comparing it to the stage version, a lot of the power of Defying Gravity at the theater is that it's just Elphaba with a broom. It's so powerful as a song that you don't need anything else really. And I wish they had sort of stayed with that because especially when you got a singer like Cynthia River, she's so good. You can just put a spotlight on, let her sing. It's gonna be
You
great.
don't
I
you
think
don't need to have
sometimes
go ahead.
I think sometimes the simplicity is what works.
Yeah, you don't have to have this grand chase up a spiral staircase and then have interspersed dialogue and then go back to the song, do
Yeah.
some more dialogue, go back to the song. I've seen recordings of Defying Gravity on YouTube in 360p or whatever. It's just Elphaba on a broomstick rising up. That's all it is. She's not flying around the tower. She's not buzzing the tower. She's not exploding the tower. There's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple. And I agree with you. It should be simple. I don't think I need a musical sting like, oh, she's gonna get her broom. She's gonna get her broom. Like I don't
It's
need an
just like
MCU. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I just feel like it's just because you can do that stuff, it doesn't mean that you have to. Sure, it's cool to see a chase scene, but it's not needed. It's just too much, I think, in that moment, and it does take away from the performance and what the cliffhanger is meant to be.
Yeah, and then the concern I have with part two slash for good is how much story do you have to tell? Do you have another 2.5 hours? Because the stage show isn't that long. I don't think I've
No.
ever been to a 5 hour Broadway musical. Like, if you don't have another 2.5 hours, are we gonna get a tight 90-minute movie? If so, just, I don't know. Obviously, I'm wrestling with it because yeah, Define Gravity is the obvious split, but I don't know. Maybe you could just make a 4 hour movie out of this.
Yeah, interesting because in part one they could add stuff on Elphaba's backstory, but
Yeah.
in part two, I think if you know a bit of the narrative of it, there's a lot less space to go back to
Mhm.
that. If you do have to expand on Elphaba, it's part one, and that's it. And I think there's gonna be more original songs in part two, so maybe that's where that comes from. But I'm really interested. I have a theory that they're gonna do. I don't know if my theory is correct, but I have a theory that they're gonna do a lot more with the Wizard of Oz stuff than what we see in
Yeah.
the musical. But I don't. I might be incorrect.
Oh, you're correct. I've seen some first look stuff for Wicked for good, and I'm like, yeah, they're going all in on the Wizard of Oz stuff.
It's interesting because the whole thing. Oh God, I'm gonna go on a tangent here. I'll be brief, but the whole thing with the show is that they can't show Wizard of Oz stuff because it's a different thing. Like it's a different company, and so it's a different sort of like ownership of the rights. So there is a lot of stuff that they can't show and they allude to. Obviously, that's Dorothy, obviously that's the Wizard of Oz, but they can't say. So I'm wondering how that's going down. Have they bought rights? Is it public domain now? I don't think so. That's going to be fascinating, even just from a sort of legal point of view, which sounds really
Mhm.
boring, but interests me.
I think they're going to do what I've seen in the first looks. They're never showing Dorothy's face. Every time you see anything Wizard of Oz, at least in part one and the first look I've seen, it's always like you can't see her face.
Yeah.
Like you see a quick sneaker shot and it's silver shoes instead of the red ones. You see the Wizard of Oz in the beginning of No One Mourns the Wicked. And in the background, you're like, oh, and there they are, and now we're gone. So I think it'll be very much like that. But yeah, I have concerns. Are we so scared of an intermission? By we, I mean the entertainment industry, like
Hmm.
movies and TV shows. I mean, The Brutalist apparently has a intermission.
And it's
Can't we
fantastic. Bring back intermissions. I loved it.
just have a 20-minute intermission, come back, get your snacks, and then here's another hour? I feel like that would work. Maybe that's where my length concerns go into effect, where I wanted 30 minutes on top of this because it just kind of ends right when it's getting good. And it's just like, oh, well, now you gotta wait a year. Okay, well, all right, fine, I guess.
Long time as well. A year is a long time.
Well, and then there's 6 months for the Blu-ray from when it came out in theater. You've got it doesn't come out till February, so it's like, what's the big deal? I guess this is our last question. As somebody who's watched the musical and knows the whole story, not just part one, like, were there any plot revelations or twists that surprised you? How do you think they impact the second part of the film?
I think there's a lot of moments where I was like, oh, this is gonna come back in part two. I could just sit there and know this was gonna be important. And I think maybe a lot of people would only realize it after. So I really enjoy that. I think they did a good job at like obviously not giving away too much, but also really setting up things. So that was really kind of fun to watch. And also the all the little callbacks and Easter eggs, you obviously don't really expect them, and most of them are not in the musical. So that's always fun, especially like when you're walking in with the idea of spotting Easter eggs and stuff. It's it's just really good to, if you're a fan of both the movie and the stage musical, it keeps it fresh, I think, and keeps it different just enough to make you excited. And I think the little changes, like obviously in terms of like showing Oz, it's just always fun to expand on something you love in a
Mhm.
way that couldn't have been shown in the stage musical version. So I really, really like that. I also liked, I think in terms of like things that maybe didn't surprise me because we knew who the actress was, but I really appreciated that for Nessa Rose, it's the first time an actor in a wheelchair is cast. And I thought, first of all, why did it take us so long? But I thought that was really, really cool. And it's one of the ways this movie adaptation can expand on something and make it more relevant and like make
Mhm.
it ours in a way. Like it is a product of this time. And I'm really glad that they did this innovation, and it was about time, but also it's not a given that they would. So obviously that wasn't a surprise because I knew working in, but that was one of the things that I was really happy to see, because I followed along like the whole casting. So I think it's so important to do that and to make the spaces accessible in general, but especially in what feels like one of the only roles in musical theater for wheelchair users. It's really important to prioritize that, especially now in 2025. Like, I don't think it's an option not to.
I didn't realize that they hadn't shown Oz in the musical. I figured it was just part of that one short day thing.
Yeah, you are in Oz, but obviously you don't see the whole like grandiose thing. It's like, oh, they put the green lights. That is so cool. It's obviously on a stage, so I understand there's significantly less they can do, but it doesn't feel like the Oz of the Wizard of Oz to me. Maybe it does in the magic of the theater, but it's like, oh, there's green lights and there's like a backdrop. Like it's cool, but obviously it doesn't really compare to what you actually are able to create in a movie version.
Without giving spoilers for part two about Nessa Rose, I think it'll be interesting to see what how that part
Yeah,
evolves.
they're
Um,
gonna change something, and I'm interested to see how that's happening. I don't think that's a spoiler because even the actress said it. So,
oh, she said the thing about
well, she said
the
they're gonna change something in part two, and she can't say too much, but it's gonna be different.
okay.
So I'm
Hmm.
like, oh, how's it gonna be different?
I think I know how it's going to be different. And that's going to be very
I have a
interesting.
theory, but hey, we'll see. I think I'm just gonna say that I think the thing that they're changing, how do I say this one? She's gonna get something that she doesn't get in the musical, but she's getting something nonetheless. We shall see.
Oh, I gotcha. I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Um, thank you, TikTok whiteboard lady, for the spoil.
Lady with the whiteboard. What?
Yeah, you'll get a shout out in the show description. I think it'll be interesting going into part two, thing because you talked about callbacks and TikTok was part of figuring out the callbacks because it was just like, oh yeah, Fiyero's doing something that hints towards something in part two, and Bach's doing something that
Ooh,
references his future. And just little things like that. I think that was very interesting to find out, and I'll be interested to see how they execute it because I'm really concerned about the runtime. Don't follow the formula of the Hobbit movies. The Hobbit was 100 pages. It was nice, concise, and it got in, that did its job, and what went out. The movies, those were 9 hours,
that's insane.
all things
That is
put together.
unbelievable.
Don't do the same thing here. Like, obviously, we're not going to get a 6 hour movie. Um, Otherwise, we'd have a part three, part four, part five, which I don't think is entirely out of the picture here because Steven Schwartz said he wants to develop other things that aren't necessarily Wicked, but in the same
Oh dear Lord.
universe, which I think I know what they are, but they're
I
also
don't know
part
how I
two
feel about
spoilers.
that.
But I'll be interested to see what happens with part two. Before we outro, before I invite you back to talk about Wicked for Good in November,
There.
did I miss anything we should maybe talk about?
I think one thing to say is like whether or not you like Wicked, I think it's really impressive how it got people in the cinema. I feel like after the pandemic, there's this constant struggle of like cinema going, and just to some level, I understand it because it's really expensive. But
Mhm.
I think it's really impressive how like it sort of became a global phenomenon. Maybe like Barbie was last year, 2 years ago.
Mhm.
Anyway. Um, and I think to give credit where credit is due, that is such a big achievement in an age when realistically people are going to the cinema less and less, and to get these big numbers, and so many people went twice as well, or even three times. I think that's amazing and hopefully a good sign for the future.
Yeah, because even when Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning came out, um, it was like, okay, people are coming to this movie, but they're waiting for it to stream on Paramount Plus. Which, I am guilty of. I wait for stuff to stream as well. I maybe wouldn't have even seen it if my friends didn't want to see it. I've got Peacock, but I'm glad I did see it on the big screen. Even audio mix issues aside, I hope we learn the right lesson from Wicked and not that everything needs two parts. Don't learn
Yeah.
that.
Oh, I hope
Don't learn that
not.
lesson.
That's not the
Um,
lesson here.
like maybe the lesson if Wicked Part Two does bad is just put an intermission in. It's
I'd love if
gonna
that was the lesson.
in a world where people are praising the Brutalist for having a 20-minute intermission. I think it's time, just do an intermission, come back 20 minutes later.
They're doing it for the brutalist, so it can be done.
How do you keep track of people who just not realize there's an intermission and leave? Um,
That's true.
but other than that, that's an easy problem to solve. Just make sure people are uh,
Aware.
notified. I just hope we don't learn the wrong lesson. I hope Wicked doesn't turn into a multimedia franchise.
No, please.
I don't need a TV show called Wicked Plus. I don't need a video game called Wicked the video game. I don't need
Yeah, we
it.
don't need
And
a TV show on Munchkinland. No one cares.
that's the kind of thing Peacock would do.
It would be like a day in Munchkinland, and there's randomized characters that nobody cares about.
The Day of the Munchkin. That's season three of the Day of the Jackal.
I
Um,
can't do it.
One Short Day in Oz. I'll be interested to see the critical responses because a lot of people, or to part two, I've heard a lot of people say that they're worried about part two because they think part two is not the best executed part of the musical. I mean,
Interesting. I agree. I think part one is the more interesting one. Part two, you do learn a lot of stuff, but I think part one works best. It's very solid. It's a good mix of dark elements and funnier stuff. Part two loses a bit of that whimsical irony stuff. So it's gonna be tricky. I think it's trickier to adapt as well.
they should just go in the other direction, just fully adapt the book in part two, just
Oh God, don't do that. I'm
before.
scared. Mom, come pick me up. What is this?
I'll be interested to see what it's like. And maybe they'll edit it into one movie. Maybe some internet magician will do that and fulfill the dreams. Needless to say, you're invited for Wicked for Good. Opening week, you can come back on here, talk about it, and then we can talk about all the things we're talking about today, fully
That we
unspoilered.
couldn't say.
Yeah, all the things we couldn't say that the whiteboard lady spoiled me about on TikTok. So, with that said, listener, watcher, person on the other side of the screen, what did you think of Wicked Part 1? I'd love to hear your thoughts on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, wherever you're on social media at Austin B Media, my very own Discord, and Patreon. And speaking of my Patreon, you'd have early access to the next episode of the Austin B Media podcast and everything else I post there on patreon.com/Austin B Media. Just $3 a month gets you 48-hour early access as well as access to Patreon only channels of my Discord. There's also a $10 a month tier where you unlock uncut podcast episodes, exclusive podcast episodes, and more. And I have a third tier, which is just a tip jar. So if you want to donate $1, you can do that on my Patreon. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a rating on your podcast app. Thank you, Clotilde, for joining me today. Where can people follow your work?
So let me get this right. I'm at the Perks of Being Chloe on Instagram and Threads that I never use. Letterboxd and Twitter is at Films with Chloe. I do have Blue Sky. I think I used it like 4 months ago, but I do have it, and it's just my name and surname.
That about does it for this episode. I've been your host, Austin Belzer. Until next time.